hello to everybody at home. Hello, Anne. Hello, Matthew. There's David. Hi, Tamara. So wonderful to see you all here. So excited to get to the next portion of our event. For people who are just joining us, this is an event called What Can Canada Learn from Costa Rica's Path to Demilitarization? And we've just finished watching A Bold Peace, an incredibly brilliant, inspiring film. For those of you who are not watching this event live, we'll be posting the links to rent or to buy the film with the recording of this discussion. And so we're now moving in to the discussion period, and we're going to be hearing from our esteemed panel. We're joined by the filmmaker Matthew Eddy, by activist Tamara Lorincz, Colonel Ann Wright, and we'll also be hearing from Ambassador Alvaro Cedeño Molinari when he has a moment. We're going to be catching him between a half marathon and I believe a birthday party. So we're very lucky that he's made some time for us. So again, for those of you who are just tuning in, this is the event, What Can Canada Learn from Costa Rica's Path to Demilitarization? I'm Bianca Mugyenyi. I represent the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute, which challenges unjust foreign policy measures and aims to bridge the gap between the reality and perception of Canada's role in the world. And Matthew, filmmaker, has kindly donated t-shirts and buttons to the CFPI. So all new sustainers this month will receive a button and a t-shirt. So you can become a sustainer at foreignpolicy.ca/donate. I'm co-hosting this event today with David Heap, who is in London, Ontario, for an in-person event. The event is also co-presented by WILPF, by the Canadian Voice of Women for Peace, by World Beyond War, by the London People for Peace, the London chapter of the Council of Canadians, and World Beyond War. We'll be hearing more about some of the co-sponsoring organizations shortly. World Beyond War, I'll tell you a little bit about them. They're a global nonviolent movement to end war and establish a just and sustainable peace. And you can find out about this really impactful organization at www.worldbeyondwar.org. So after our speakers give their initial remarks, we'll be opening it up to questions from the audience. So please do post your questions in the Q&A box, and we'll get to as many as we can, time permitting, and David will be taking questions from people live in London, Ontario. So now for our speakers, it is with great pleasure that I welcome our first panelist of the afternoon, Matthew Eddy. Matthew is the lead director, writer, and producer of the documentary film A Bold Peace. He is an associate professor of sociology at Southern Utah University. His dissertation included several chapters analyzing Costa Rican history, as well as survey evidence of robust, nonviolent attitudes among Costa Rican people. He spent 3 summers collecting data, filming interviews in Costa Rica. He's also served as a human rights observer engaged in nonviolent protective accompaniment in Chiapas, Mexico, and Israel, Palestine, and published articles on US military veterans and the perceptions of military recruiters, as well as nonviolence and international human rights NGOs operating in high conflict zones around the world. Welcome, Matthew.
Well, thank you so much. Can you hear me fine?
Yeah, you're great.
Thank you so much. I'm really delighted to participate, and thanks to everybody for organizing this and pulling together the panel and all of that. I'm really impressed with what you all are doing up in Canada. So I'm just going to make a few comments here. I guess I have 5 minutes or so. So it is interesting to come back to the film after, of course, promoting it for several years, traveling with the film around the world with film festivals and so forth. And, you know, the dust on this project is kind of settled, and it's interesting to watch it again after it's been a few years. But one of the things that comes to mind is the reception of the film in the US was quite muted. Other countries seem to get quite a bit more excited about it. But just for example, PBS, which is, you know, like our version of the BBC, you know, it would certainly never screen a film like this. It's too critical of US military and US foreign policy. But they did screen a film, and it was a well-made documentary about Jose Figueres's love life. essentially, totally dodging very much discussion about demilitarization in that film. But I'm still very inspired by Costa Ricans and their example. I've met Costa Ricans who feel that Jose Figueres should be as famous as Gandhi in their own biased opinion. They think that he made a significant contribution to nonviolence and peace. And thinking about Costa Rica as a sociologist, I would just throw out a few suggestions here that they seem to have some things going for them when it comes to demilitarization. Okay, so sorry for my list here, but geopolitically, not having oil, for example, not having resources like that. Number two, just being a small nation, and fewer power elites, fewer powerful institutions, maybe easier to get people on board with significant reforms. They also had a tradition of a relatively small military for a long time. They were the third country in the world to abolish the death penalty, and that's in 1877. So there does seem to be something in the water down there, in the values, in the climate there, in terms of cultural climate, that they're able to experiment with these reforms. Being a small country makes them have a vested interest in international law, which, I mean, the contrast couldn't be more stark with my own country in the United States. Of course, they have been at times realistic. They have often been a close ally of the US, but I would say that a lot of skeptics overemphasize that. For example, they do not have a US military base on their soil. I mean, that's pretty significant. I mean, even, for example, Iceland, for many years, they had Air Force Base there and so forth, US Air Force Base in Iceland. So Costa Rica has often taken a distance from US policies and pushed for international laws and respecting them, and beefing up the international security through international organizations and so forth. Fourth, I would say that they were lucky with having some well-educated leaders. I mean, they have elected presidents with PhDs, for example, something almost impossible to imagine happening in the US. Never happened here. But Jose Figueres had this balance of idealism and pragmatism, able to push in progressive directions. And, again, although Jose Figueres never graduated from university, he was self-educated and a passionate reader. Not many American presidents would fit that profile. Fifth, the last thing I'll mention here is the timing of demilitarization in Costa Rica was lucky. So 1948, this is just a few years before the Cold War starts really heating up in Latin America. So the timing was very lucky. You could argue that if Figueres had come along a few years later with his Social Democratic Party and his dream of New Deal-like reforms, this most progressive period in US history, the New Deal period, US would have just never stood for it. They would have sponsored a coup. And the proof of that is, look what happened in 1954, just 6 years later in Guatemala. You had a moderate socialist, moderate leftist President Arbenz overthrown with the help of the US military in 1954. So the US was actually supportive of Figueres, but would they have been just a few years later when they were starting to be paranoid, to use a term that one of the Costa Ricans used in our film? The US was so paranoid at this point about communism, and they would have probably depicted Figueres as an extreme leftist, talking about redistribution of wealth and so forth. So I come back to the power of the US, and the contrast between Costa Rica and the US couldn't be more stark. But, I would, as an outsider, I would suggest Canada has maybe more wiggle room or maybe could more readily push in the direction of reducing military budgets. But we have our hands full with that struggle here in the US. I mean, let me just, in my last comments, just highlight a few contrasts with the US. Costa Rica has an independent elections tribunal, something we badly need, we don't have. Obviously the militarism here in the US. The US military is the most trusted institution, major institution in the culture here in the US. And why? So I sit here in Cedar City, Utah. We're just 175 miles east of the Nevada test site where they exploded over 900 nuclear tests between 1951 and 1992. 100 of them were above ground, 828 were underground. We have high cancer rates in this part of the country, right here in Cedar City, Utah, in St. George, Utah. And yet, even though we know the US military essentially sacrificed people in this part of the country, people still trust the military. We have a problem with a lack of social solidarity and social inclusion, to say the least, in this country, in the US. And we have no strong social democratic tradition in the US. We have aggression against the poor, unlike Costa Rica with their refreshing solidarity. It's not a perfect country. They have their own challenges, but anyway, I'll have to leave it there for now, and I'm interested to hear from the other panelists.
Thanks. Thank you so much, Matthew. So much to learn from Costa Rica. Thank you so much for making this film, for this important film. Thank you for your piece work, and also thanks for taking the time to be here with us today to talk to us about it. So looking very forward to hearing more from you in the Q&A. Our next speaker of the afternoon is Ann Wright. Ann is a 29-year U.S. Army Reserves veteran who retired as a colonel and former U.S. diplomat who resigned in March 2003 in opposition to the war on Iraq. She had served in Nicaragua, Grenada, Somalia, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Sierra Leone, Micronesia, Mongolia, and Afghanistan. She is an active member with Code Pink and Veterans for Peace. Ann is the author of the book Dissent, Voices of Conscience, and has written many peace and anti-war articles that can be found on Common Dreams. Welcome, Ann.
Well, thank you very much, and congratulations on Matthew for this excellent film. You know, it really brings back so much of you know, what we really need to remember about countries who are willing to stand up to American imperialism. And I, being part of the imperial empire for all too long, I've now been out of the government for 20 years, but I was in it almost 40 years. So there's a lot of history in my background, and a lot of it has to do with the area right around Costa Rica. I was assigned, and my first assignment as a diplomat was in Nicaragua, and that was in the last days of the Sandinistas. Prior to that, I had been in Panama with the U.S. military at the U.S. Southern Command. Later on, when the U.S. invaded Panama, I was on a reserve assignment there for a short period of time. So Costa Rica has been a central part of a lot of U.S. policies, and that the United States has, in a way, kind of kept its hands off Costa Rica and has not exerted extraordinary pressure, although plenty of pressure. And in fact, it's not a completely demilitarized society. I mean, when the U.S. military does send ships in, one of the photos that I'll never forget was a big U.S. military ship. And I think it was the first one that had ever come into one of the Costa Rican ports. And that was maybe about 6 or 7 years ago. So the U.S. is certainly trying to, I wouldn't say militarize Costa Rica, but it is well aware that it is a key part in Central America. And don't be surprised if there are inroads that the U.S. military is trying to make in Costa Rica. What this holds for Canada in its attempt to demilitarize, well, good luck, as Canada is a solid member of NATO, and NATO is certainly going after every country to keep increasing the amount of money that that each of our nations contribute. And with this war that the NATO is a part of in Ukraine, the pressures on all of the countries that the U.S. is putting on to increase the amount of weaponry that each country contributes, the numbers of military folks that are being sent over to Europe. The United States continues to send more and more troops that are in Poland, Romania, and Ukraine. So Canada has to watch out for that because they're, under great pressure for it. But back to Costa Rica. I mean, I did spend almost 6 years of my life living in countries around Costa Rica and going to Costa Rica many times to enjoy the benefits of that country. And I've also been back there after I resigned from the government. And we were asked to come down there by the American Friends, the Quakers that are in Costa Rica, to help continue to lobby the Costa Rican government not to fall prey to what the U.S. keeps pushing on it. And we were given meetings with members of the parliament, with the Inter-American Human Rights Council on issues that were going on that the organizers felt our voices could be a part of. I'll just mention that, the numbers of Costa Ricans that have really played such an integral part of peace in our world, that, trying to get things like the wars of Central America stopped, the Escapulas Agreement back in the 1980s between the Central America and El Salvador, Nicaragua, all of these countries under pressure from the United States, and particularly Nicaragua, that had the U.S. mounting its Contras attack on Nicaragua. But there's another figure that I'd like to bring up, who's a more recent person from Costa Rica that has done an incredible job for world peace. And that's the ambassador from Costa Rica to the United Nations, Ambassador Elaine White Gomez. And she was the person that shepherded the abolition of nuclear weapons resolution through the United Nations 3 or 4 years ago. And if it was not for her incredible diplomatic approach to all of the countries, and it worked. I mean, the vote of the General Assembly was, let's abolish nuclear weapons. Of course, the countries that have nuclear weapons voted against it, but she was able to round up all the rest of, essentially the rest of the countries. And now, the voting on that is going on, and a lot of countries have voted to say, we have to eliminate nuclear weapons. And that is a very important part of what we're living through now with nuclear countries challenging each other in Europe now. So with that, I will close and look forward to everyone else. And thank you very much for this opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you. This isn't going to work.
We're just dealing with some feedback.
You're not going to hear in the room. You can hear me here, right? That's good. That works. Okay, they can hear me in the room this way. Thank you, Ann. And also in her bio, Ann is a multiple-time participant and leader of flotilla voyages in the Freedom Flotilla against Gaza. And we'll be speaking later this afternoon with the Freedom Flotilla Coalition. Lovely, as always, to have you, Ann. It's my pleasure now to introduce Tamara Lorincz, who is a peace activist, but also a PhD student at the Balsillie School of International Affairs in Waterloo, a member of the Canadian Voice of Women for Peace and the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom Canada, two of the organizations sponsoring today's event. And she was recently at an event in Toronto where George Bush was speaking in order to protest and disrupt it and call him out loud what he was, a war criminal, before she was removed from the hall. She's also disrupted Defense Minister, the Defense Minister's breakfast in Oakville, calling on her to stop sending weapons to Ukraine, stop the war, and support the peace process in Ukraine and peace with Russia. Over to you, Tamara.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Just a second. I need to turn the sound on in the room.
I think David will give you.
Okay. So good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be with you all. And I am so glad that you have all watched this important film. And I am very grateful to Matthew Eddy for making this film. I have shown this film many times across the country, in Victoria, in Regina, in Ottawa, in Waterloo, where I live, and in Fredericton. And this film needs to be shown more. I want to urge you to host a screening in your community and to consider getting your public library to have a copy of this film. I also want to urge you, if you aren't already, to be active in the peace movement. It is urgent that you do so. And that's because in Canada, militarism is getting much worse. So military spending has increased 70% over the past 8 years. As reported to NATO, Canada spent $20 billion in 2014 on its military, and now spending is at $35 billion, while our country is facing a climate catastrophe and a housing crisis and a poverty crisis. Our Defense Minister, Anita Anand, just announced $8 billion more for the military in this year's federal budget, and another 70% increase to military spending over the next 5 years. Canada's arms exports have increased to almost $3 billion. Canada exports weapons to Saudi Arabia, Ukraine, Israel, that prolongs violent conflict and promotes human rights abuses, and this is all in violation of the Arms Trade Treaty. Costa Rica doesn't export weapons. It was Costa Rica that led the negotiations for the Arms Trade Treaty, and it is Costa Rica that led the negotiations for the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. But Canada is refusing to join the TPNW because of our membership in NATO, a US-led nuclear-armed military alliance. Costa Rica's path of demilitarization has led to its incredible leadership on decarbonization and biological conservation. Over the past 30 years, Costa Rica has expanded its marine protected areas and has doubled its forest cover. Costa Rica has an ambitious national decarbonization plan and can power almost all of its electricity on renewable energy. Last year, while I was in Glasgow at the climate summit, COP26, Costa Rica launched the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance, BOGA. Canada, though, is refusing to join BOGA, and instead Canada is building new pipelines and investing in more oil and gas projects. And Canada has failed to meet every single climate target. Now, the next 8 years is crucial to stopping catastrophic climate change, but we can't decarbonize if we don't demilitarize and work peacefully with other countries. The military is the most carbon intensive institution in all of our countries. Now, I'm going to share my screen right now. Okay, so last week on Wednesday, September 21st, Peace Day, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Costa Rica, Arnaldo André Tonico, gave an excellent, inspiring statement to the UN General Assembly, and I want to read part of his speech to the world. Quote, "For my country, it is inconceivable that while millions of people are waiting for vaccines, medicines, or food to save their lives, the richest countries continue to prioritize their resources and armaments at the expense of people's well-being, climate health, and equitable recovery. In 2021, global military spending continued to increase for the 7th consecutive year to reach the highest figure we have ever seen in history. Costa Rica today reiterates its call for a gradual and sustained reduction in military spending. For the more weapons we produce, the more will escape even our best efforts at management and control. It is about prioritizing the lives and well-being of people and the planet over the profits to be made from weapons and war. It is about investing in and actively building alternative approaches to security, approaches that facilitate cooperation and care rather than competition and violence. Let us promote a new agenda for peace that strengthens our collective capacity to prevent conflicts and resolve existing ones with sustainable, local-driven solutions, unquote. That is Costa Rica's message to the world. I encourage you to read his entire speech. On the international stage, Costa Rica is respected and admired by other countries, but not Canada. It is why Canada failed to win a seat on the UN Security Council. We must face this truth and this choice. To achieve the Paris Agreement and the UN Sustainable Development Goals, Canada must follow the inspiring example of Costa Rica and demilitarize. To make this happen, we need, across Canada, people-powered movement. Please join or support a local peace group like London People for Peace, and subscribe to the Canadian Peace and Justice Network and the Canadian Foreign Policy Network, the great e-newsletters. We need to put pressure on the federal government and the political parties like the Greens and the NDP to make peace, disarmament, demilitarization, and the withdrawal of NATO and NORAD priorities. We must stop sending weapons to Ukraine and to end the war. We need peace in Ukraine and peace in Russia. And finally, I want to encourage you to check out the resources that we have about demilitarization on the CFPI website. And I will also want to encourage you to follow Maritza Chan. She is the first female ambassador and permanent representative to Costa Rica at the United Nations, and follow her on Twitter and you will learn a lot. I will put that information in the chat. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Tamara. It's now our great pleasure to introduce one more guest who's joined us just now. Alvaro Cedeño is a Costa Rican diplomat. He holds a master's degree in peace and conflict transformation from Tromsø University in Norway, and another master's degree in public policy and management from Carnegie Mellon University in Adelaide, Australia. He has been a Costa Rican public servant and diplomat in Beijing, and ambassador to Japan and to the World Trade Organization in Geneva. At the WTO, he launched and led a coalition of developing countries to raise awareness and momentum about e-commerce for development, which has now become a plurilateral negotiation among 80 plus member nations. His mandate also included launching a coalition of member countries to raise awareness on sustainable trade that's evolved into a coalition of over 60 participants on climate change, trade, and sustainability. He's now a partner at tactic.legal, where he works on talent development oriented towards industries of the future. He lives in San Jose with his wife and 2 children. He just finished a half marathon, and he's joining us as he cooks supper for his dad's birthday. Thank you for taking time to join us today, Alvaro.
That was a very thorough introduction. Thank you very much. And hello, everyone. Everything that you just said is true, and even the smallest of my toes hurts right now. But I'm very happy to be here and to be able to share a few thoughts on, well, the commemoration of the International Peace Day, and a little bit about what Costa Rica, what it feels like to be Costa Rican, I would say. Perhaps that's what's new in today's event, as you already saw a very interesting documentary about a history that Costa Ricans take for granted. It's been so many years since the military was abolished. My father is turning 83 years old tomorrow, and the military was abolished when he was 9 years old. So there's been several generations of Costa Ricans that have not been militarized. In our cultural upbringing, there is no form of military training or even military thought process, which is something that I find remarkable. But I was not aware of it until I moved to northern Norway, where I studied a master's in peace 20 years ago. And I became so curious about, people were asking me, do you ever feel threatened or afraid about other countries, your neighbors and other countries in the region that might invade you, and you don't have a military. And it was the first time in my life that that thought crossed my mind. So I started asking people. I made a list of 20 friends, and I started emailing them to ask them if they felt threatened about not having a military. And some people thought it was a joke that I was asking the question, but I was serious. I really wanted to know if there was a feeling of threat that I wasn't experiencing, because I've never felt threatened by not having a military. And the truth is that I am more and more convinced that not having a military is our best defense in geopolitical terms. Well, of course, we could think, who would dare invade a country without a military? But these days, I wouldn't even dare suggest names either. But the truth is that not having a military has allowed Costa Rica for many decades to have zero influence from foreign countries through military systems. That has not been the case for probably 9 or 10 countries in Latin America, the Caribbean, around the world, where foreign forces have infiltrated the military to stage coup d'etats in their political regimes. But not having a military is like an antidote to that sort of influence. So if we speak specifically about the US, this has allowed us to develop a different kind of relationship with the US. It's an extremely important trade partner for Costa Rica. And not only in terms of market access for our exports, but also, and more importantly perhaps, to attract foreign direct investment from the US. Just to give you an idea, we started creating little by little a cluster of medical devices transnational companies that manufacture their goods in Costa Rica and export them back into the US. And the last time I checked, we had 127 of those companies in Costa Rica, being the second or perhaps already the first cluster of medical devices in size outside of the US. So I think that this is the result of being a demilitarized nation. So there are multiple levels, right? At a policy level, at a cultural level. I'm not going to say that Costa Ricans are peaceful. We do get angry, and we do stupid things when we get angry, but we are not militarized. So that's never an option. And what I think being demilitarized means is that we waged peace on the rest of the world, and we have ensured the rest of the world that there will never be a military aggression from Costa Rica ever. And this gives me leeway to talk very briefly about what I think is the new peace agenda that Costa Rica is leading. I entered a bit late, so I only heard probably the last few lines of what Tamara was saying, but Costa Rica is has a very high moral authority in environmental terms and climate action. And I think what the world needs right now urgently is peace with nature. And Costa Rica is a very good actor in that agenda in multiple fronts. So if I want to make sure that my daughters celebrate the birthday age my father is celebrating tomorrow, which is going to happen in the year 2100, then there's a lot of work to get done. Otherwise, we're not going to make it. Sometimes I feel that the fact that we see end of century scenarios so distant to anyone that is an adult today makes us brush the dust under the rug and feel detached about the future. But in my case, the future is personal. My grandma, my father's mother, she passed away at the age of 104. So if my younger daughter, who is 5, also reaches that age, that'll be the year 2121. So the future for me is personal. I know I won't be there, but my daughters will. And well, if they have any descendants, and their generation will certainly will, they're going to be eventually our age, when this planet is going to be unrecognizably unlivable in many places. So this is, I think it's absolutely mandatory that we take it seriously, and that we understand that violence in all its forms is anything that alters harmony. And in many aspects of the world, we are so distant to harmony at a civilizational level, but also at a biospheric level. All forms of life are suffering. There are dozens of forms of life that are becoming extinct every day and are not coming back. So I think it's important that we have clarity about what's the goal and what's the reason why we should do this. So maybe this has already been discussed, maybe not, but I just throw it out there as a motivational thought that the last 35 years, Costa Rica has been an exemplar of regenerative development. So in this period of time, we've managed to double our forest coverage, because before 1980, we did cut down a significant amount of very old trees that gave very fine wood, and we were losing our forest coverage, and we were affecting our biodiversity, our rain pattern systems, our aquifers, our rivers. So we launched a campaign to bring the forests back, and 35 years later, we've managed to double our forest coverage. We are right now at 54% of forest coverage, more or less. But more remarkably is that in that same period of time, our economy has grown sevenfold, partly as a result of launching industries that are oriented to nature, like tourism, for example. So before COVID, Costa Rica was receiving 3.4 million tourists per year. That was 2019. Then with COVID, everything shut down, and that has been hugely impactful in many negative ways for employment in rural areas. But the last week, I read statistics about tourism this year, and we're already up to 2.4 million tourists in the last 12 months. So the numbers are starting to look very similar to pre-COVID, with the very significant difference that before COVID, tourists would come to Costa Rica an average of 10 days per visit and would spend an average of $100 per day. But since COVID, people are coming to Costa Rica for months, and some of them are coming here as nomads for a year, and then they can renew that visa for another year. They're applying for temporary residency, and you have North Americans flocking into Costa Rica in numbers that I had never seen before. And they're not here to travel; they're here to live. They're here to work. They're here to feel better than they feel back home, I guess. So this is also very interesting. And when we think about what would work as a business and development model for most developing countries around the world, especially the 70 tropical countries around the equator, it would make a very strong business sense to regenerate ecosystems and to structure businesses that are aligned with nature. And this is going to bring, as I would like to say, it would create well-being for the biosphere, hopefully forever. Well, I would say that this is the little message that I had prepared for today. So I'm pretty sure that you're going to have a very interesting discussion. I have to go back to the kitchen, but I'm open to questions if you have any at the moment.
Thank you so much, Alvaro. That was really great to have that context, and Thank you for your heartfelt words. It's very inspiring to hear about Costa Rica's path. And also thanks for that urgent call for peace with nature as well, and for making time for us on such a busy day. It's impressive. So that concludes our presentations for the day, and we're now going to be moving on to the Q&A portion of the afternoon. The first question is actually for you, Alvaro, and it's from Ann, who would like to know, does the Costa Rica National Police receive training from US law enforcement? And if so, is any of that training becoming more militarized?
Thank you. I know that there is a training center. I believe it's called the School of the Americas, but I could be wrong. That the U.S. has somewhere in Florida to train Latin American military, and I would guess that at some levels, some of our police chiefs do go there for an internship or whatever. But we do not have U.S. military presence in Costa Rica. We have a constitutional agreement with the U.S. to patrol our continental waters, our oceans, especially because of drug trafficking. And if they need to dock to fuel, and if the military officers want to come on land, they have to do it unarmed. But I don't have a straight answer to that question. I would guess so, but definitely our police is not becoming more militarized. Our police is, it has very high respect from the population. People do respect our policemen and women. I mean, this is a very small country. We all know a neighborhood where a policeman lives, and we all somehow are related one way or another with people that are relatives to policemen and women. So we know for a fact that the training they receive and the salaries they get are so bad that it's actually commendable that they offer themselves to do this kind of work. And I wouldn't say they are being militarized, not in their training, nor in the hardware that they use.
Thank you, Alvaro. So we're just going to take a few more questions from the room here, and then I'm going to hand it over to David to take some questions from folks in London. So the next question that we have is from Deborah in St. John's, Newfoundland, who wants to know about action. And one thing that she is asking is, can we start by petitioning governments worldwide? So what do folks think about Deborah's suggestion for action? And do you have any ideas of your own? Maybe we can start with you, Tamara.
Yeah, thanks for the question. So I wanted to let everybody know that the Canadian Voice of Women for Peace has brought on a really fantastic peace campaigner named Sarah, and we have another peace intern named Anjali. And we're going to be working together this fall on a peace campaign for Canada, calling for Canada to withdraw from NATO, to reduce military spending, to sign on to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. We're going to launch things like a petition and have social media graphics. We're really going to need your support. And we're going to work through the Canada-wide Peace and Justice Network. And we'd really like to encourage individuals and groups to be part of this network, because it's a great way to stay up to date with the different activities and that we're organizing. It's a great way to share resources. So I'll put a link in the chat for the Canada-wide Peace and Justice Network as one way for you to get involved. But stay tuned, more is coming. And we also have an action on stopping Canada from buying fighter jets and from buying new armed drones, and I'll put links for the petitions in the chat for that as well. Thanks.
Thank you, Tamara. Does anyone else want to comment on action? All right, so the next question, again for Alvaro, is from Marlene. How important do you think the Costa Rican motto of Pura Vida is in keeping the cultural mindset in a positive place and fostering peace?
I love that expression. So Pura Vida literally translates as pure life, but it has multiple meanings, and it's very useful to say good morning or hello or goodbye or thank you or please. And it's such a nice term that we also take for granted. We don't know what it is until we go somewhere else, and we don't hear it for months and months, and suddenly someone identifies with us being Costa Rican, and they say pura vida because they've heard it, or they've been here. I think attitude is everything. And the fact that Costa Rica has had this multi-generational relationship with demilitarization, with universal healthcare, with public obligatory education sponsored by the state, has made us be in a particular way. More importantly, I would say that this is a place where people don't have. There are very few constraints to freedom, and for many generations there hasn't been many constraints to freedom. So we can experiment and we can explore, and it's okay to make mistakes. And everybody laughs when you make a mistake and then you try again. And it's I think that's an important substrate for innovation, actually, and for entrepreneurship. And a lot of what we see here is people trying every day, getting things done without many limitations. And when I say without many limitations, I look at Honduras, for example, which is my mother's motherland. And hundreds of thousands of people have to migrate because their lands are not fertile anymore. There is no drinking water. There are rampant mafias, drug trafficking, police is corrupt, government is ineffective, to say the least, and this is absolutely preventable. It could have been different, right? I mean, there is really no simple explanation as to why Costa Rica has grown so differently from the rest of Central America since our independence 201 years ago. But I do believe that having this safety and this security and this possibility to express yourself in freedom has made us develop this pura vida attitude that, I lived 14 years abroad and I always wanted to come back to this. So I'm very happy to be here.
Thank you, Alvaro. So one last question from us over here in Zoom land. What about alternatives to NATO and NORAD? Can anyone sort of comment on this? Like, what are some meaningful alternatives to NATO and to NORAD?
Well, I'll just mention there are a lot of alternatives that NATO and NORAD can take among themselves. I mean, the expansion of military exercises, war maneuvers in Europe was one of the trigger points, I think, for the war that we see now between Russia and Ukraine. The NATO military exercises right along the border with Russia, that Russia kept saying, don't do this. This is provocative. It's our national security we're after, which is no excuse, in my opinion, for the invasion of Ukraine. But for several years, the Russian government had been warning NATO that you're really jeopardizing our national security. Major military NATO exercises that are going on up in Scandinavia now. NATO even coming out to the Pacific. We've had, I live in Hawaii, and we've had the Rim of the Pacific military naval war maneuvers. It's the largest naval exercise in the world this summer. 26 nations, 25,000 people, 8 NATO countries were a part of coming to the Pacific. So all of these military exercises that are going on around the world, and with NATO as kind of the instigator of this, with the U.S. certainly right behind it, pushing it the whole time, are things that I think we as global citizens need to be getting our governments, and we in the U.S. have a great responsibility on trying to control our government and U.S. military, but trying to get these massive exercises that are very, very provocative, and a mistake in any of them can be a horrible, horrible result for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. And just to quickly add, to maybe Tamara or Matthew could comment on this, to people who sort of say, well, how do we defend our borders then without a military? What would you say to those? Because this comes up a lot for people who are concerned about Canadian sovereignty in the north and Russia flying over, you know, quote unquote, our Arctic.
Well, just very quickly, let me say that about 30 years ago, Canada helped to establish the Arctic Council, which is a forum of all Arctic countries to use dialogue to resolve conflict in the Arctic. Canada has also, and Russia, have ratified the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Seas, which provides a framework for resolving conflict in the maritime marine environment in a peaceful way. And this was the message from the film, that international law gives us the ability to be able to resolve conflict in a non-violent way. So we need to reinvest in diplomacy. We need to strengthen these multilateral institutions and fora like the Arctic Council. And there are two really important initiatives that I've put in the chat. One is from civil society, and it's the report and the initiative called Our Common Security. You can find out more with the International Peace Bureau. And then the UN is going to be launching a new UN agenda for peace. And this comes under its Our Common Agenda that they released last year. So our task as Canadians is to push our government to participate in this and to have our own national strategy for peace and for disarmament and common security. Thanks.
Thank you, Tamara. I'm going to hand over to David now to see if there's any questions in the room.
Paula and then Jeff. I'm gonna have to repeat it. I'm sorry. You can come up here and no, it's better. Yeah, here. Speak into my mic there.
As I was watching the film, it came to my mind that you must have many from Central America who want to come and live in Costa Rica, and the people from Honduras and Nicaragua and El Salvador. Do you have a policy to receive migrants who must leave their places because of conflict? That was one question. The other was, I wondered how Costa Rica is being impacted by climate change.
We hear that okay?
Yep. Should I address that question?
Please.
Well, it's been impacted in multiple
Oh, sorry,
ways.
we've got to turn on this here. Just a minute.
Okay. Yeah, I think Costa Rica has been impacted by climate change in multiple ways. Central America itself is one of the most more climate vulnerable regions in the world, partly due to the fact that the Caribbean is the warmest sea in the world, and the one that is that its sea level is rising the fastest. So our coastline in the Caribbean is being eaten away by sea level rise. It's very tangible. I spent probably 50 holiday weekends at the Caribbean growing up 25 years ago, 30 years ago. And I stopped going for 15 years that I lived abroad. And when I came back right before COVID, I went with my family, and there's no beach. And there are hundreds of palm tree logs just washed away on the shore that are being eaten by sea level rise. And that's unquestionable. I mean, we have data that goes back 40 years to support what I'm saying. So it's not just my empirical perception, it's what's happening. And it's also happening in the Pacific, but not as dramatic as the Caribbean. then well, pollination of agricultural products, rain pattern oscillations. We are having the rainiest year since 1900, and it's just so bizarre how much it suddenly rains, and rivers overflow, and they cause massive damage, increasing the vulnerability of communities that live alongside those rivers. What else that comes to mind? Well, very dramatically, Costa Rica is the birthing place to 5 of the 7 species of marine turtles in the world. And as the temperature of the nests goes up, the sex of the turtles is shifting in dramatic numbers towards female. So before, you used to have some form of balance, which I don't know what that balance was, but now you have really large numbers of females being born. And if you have a population like turtles that have been living for 70 million years, and they've been evolving very, very slowly, surviving massive extinctions, and suddenly they are having this kind of shift in its populations. You could already predict how many more generations of sea turtles, marine turtles, will it take until there is not enough time for them to reproduce and sustain their species. So this is obviously not something that affects Costa Rica only. It affects us all if marine turtles go extinct. But we are studying it. Scientists are studying this, and well, that off the top of my head, I would say these are like the most dramatic effects that I can think of right now. And I really need to get back to the kitchen. I'm sorry.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alvaro.
You're a very good son.
Briefly from Jeff, a question.
Just wondering how we could sell to other people the idea of leaving NATO, and I'm worried in the future. There's been wars for oil, and Canada has a lot of fresh water. Could there be a war for fresh water here? How would those two things work together?
Anyone? Wars for water and out of NATO. I'm going to, if there isn't an immediate answer to that, I'm going to say that I remember when there was a political party in Canada which had a policy of Canada out of NATO and NATO out of Canada. Sadly, that's no longer the case, but it could be once again the case. The two people helping on this call, Tamara and Bianca, and I worked on a campaign. We weren't the only people, but we were part of a movement a couple of years ago calling for no Canadian seat at the UN Security Council, anybody but Canada at the UN Security Council. And that in fact launched the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute, as people were talking about a different way of seeing Canadian foreign policy. And well, I wouldn't say it's just due to us, but that vote actually was successful. And Canada, for the second time, lost a seat at the Security Council, in part because of our servile following of everything NATO does. So I think that's one way we need to sell it, that we will be a better world citizen when we get our heads out of the backside of our neighbor to the south in particular, and NATO more generally. We don't really have time for more questions. Just have time to thank you all and to say that we will be sending a follow-up email with all of the resources from the chat, everything that Tamara mentioned and showed, and some actions and some further resources. But there's one resource I need you to take away with you right now, because I'm going to go home and after my next meeting and become a sustaining supporter of the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute, not just for the awesome swag that Bianca is going to send us, the lucky ones who get there, where we still have t-shirts and buttons from Matthew's film. I have enough t-shirts and buttons, to be honest, but some of you might need the bold piece t-shirts and buttons, but mainly because of the amazing work they do, from Israel-Palestine to human rights internationally, to watching Canada's Canada's horrible record with mining sector overseas, domestic peace in this country, and so many other issues. Please, folks, consider supporting the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute for the amazing work that they do, bringing you this, but also many, many other important issues that we're talking about in Canada today. So I'd like to thank the panelists, Matthew, Tamara, Ann, and Alvaro, who had to leave us. Thanks to folks who came out to the Council of Canadians' first in-person event in 2.5 years. We're out of practice doing this. So thanks to the folks in the room, and thanks to the over 70 who joined us online. It's really heartwarming to see all these people coming out to think of doing Canadian foreign policy a different way, a different path being shown to us by the lovely example of the, as Reagan would have said, a dangerous example of waging peace in Central America and the world. So we need more peace mongers like Costa Rica. Thank you so much for being with us today, friends.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you to everyone watching and for your excellent questions. Thank you to all of the co-sponsoring organizations.
No? Oh, sorry. Just start again.
Oh, no, I'm done. All right. Good night, everyone. Peace.